Thank you for joining us today for this, the 8th lesson in our series, Studies in Faith. For the past 2 weeks, we've been talking about what we tagged as the spectrum of disbelief. 2 weeks ago, we began talking about doubt. Now, doubt is, just as it suggests, doubt that something is true. It's a struggle. Sometimes it's a struggle of faith, and it's a struggle of faith by those who believe. Oftentimes, that struggle of faith or that doubt ends up increasing faith. At other times, that doubt, the struggle wins, and a person ends up disbelieving. Now, in the middle of that spectrum that we're going to be talking about here is what we talked about last week, agnosticism. By definition, agnosticism is simply a Gnosticism against knowledge, agnostic. And so it's the belief that you cannot know. Now, it occupies the middle road between faith and atheism. And so we'll talk a little bit about atheism today. Now, atheism by definition is, as the word agnostic is, it's a, or against, theism, which is God. The Greek and Latin for God is theos. Now, atheism does not argue simply against the God of the Bible, but against the existence of God in any sense. So it's broader than what we usually think of it, though it still hits the spot that we're talking about here as far as faith is concerned. Now, when you think about atheism, a couple of things come to mind real quickly from a cultural standpoint. One is the Time magazine cover, April the 8th, 1966. In bold print, it simply asks on the cover of Time magazine, "Is God dead?" And if you'll think back, mid-60s, mid to late 60s, we know what was going on culturally, and we know then quickly what prompted that Time magazine cover. By 1982, a term was in common use by a few people. It was used first in a philosophical way in print by Friedrich Nietzsche. Now, Nietzsche, in some of his writings, has said in the early 80s, used the term simply, God is dead. And it has become part of the vernacular of a group of people ever since because of just the bold statement, God is dead. Now, Nietzsche, though, used the phrase to express his idea that the Enlightenment had indeed eliminated the possibility of God. Every believer would question the validity of that statement, as you and I would even today. There was an interesting book, and the book itself is interesting, but the title quite intriguing. Just a few years back, Frank Turek and Norman Geisler published a book entitled, "I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist." Now, in that book, they ask 4 basic questions and say that if you can answer these 4 questions, then the Bible and its claims are true. And those questions are, number 1, does truth exist? Number 2, does God exist? And number 3, are miracles possible? And then, is the New Testament true? And Frank Turek, particularly, in some of his lectures, talks about the fact that if you can acknowledge those 4 things as being true, then the Christian belief system is accurate and it is real. Others have suggested, and I would tend to agree, that it can be simplified even from that. That if you're looking at what questions need to be answered to establish the reality of the faith of the Scriptures, the faith the Scriptures speaks about, one question can be answered, I think, that would answer everything. and that is, did Jesus rise from the grave? You see, because when it comes right down to it, the resurrection is the big deal. Because the resurrection proves all that's taught in the scheme of redemption. It proves the validity of the salvation that Jesus came to argue. If Jesus rose from the dead, then there's no reason to debate other miracles. And if Jesus rose from the dead, you don't have to debate the idea of truth, because he claimed not only to bring truth, but in a sense to be truth. You don't have to debate the reality of the Old Testament. If that one event is accurate and is real and is true, then the Christian claims are all true. They all stand or fall on that one thing. Now, if you'll recall, the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 basically built that argument. So all of those, including myself, who have said it recently, are only borrowing from the Apostle Paul. Paul was willing to hang everything on the nail, if you will, of the resurrection of Jesus. But as I said, the book was interesting. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. And the real point that the title of the book makes is that an atheist has faith as well. So this idea that's put forth by many people, that Christians have faith and atheists have proof, well, it's simply not realistic. It's simply not honest, because as we've been talking about, and that's why we've kind of come this direction, as we've talked about a couple of times already, the reality is we all operate by faith. The Christians who will argue that there are natural, physical, earthly, worldly proofs of everything they believe in are not being honest. Is there evidence, and is there evidence enough to draw the conclusion? Absolutely. But there is no, the physical, worldly, empirical proof is not there. God asks us to accept it on faith. And the other side of that argument is that those who would believe in evolution, or those who would be atheists and who would rely on the science they believe in, would say, well, we have proof of all of those things, but we're very much aware these days that the proof that they would claim is not real. It's not proof, even in the sense that they claim it to be. This discussion always comes around at some level to a debate about origins. And I suppose it's going to always come around to that simply because belief in God comes down to, did God create this world we live in, as the Bible claims? Yet that's not too far from our topic as well. We'll go back to where we've gone almost every week so far in this study, and that's the beginning of Hebrews chapter 11. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it the people of old received their commendation. By faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. He begins there in the 11th chapter of Hebrews to go about a listing of what we oftentimes refer to as the hall of faith. He begins in the very next verse by talking about by faith Abel, by faith Abraham, and he goes on to quite a list of people who by their faith were moved to actions that God was well pleased with. But in the beginning here, in that definition, as a part of that definition here in the first 3 verses, we have a statement here about creation and about those people who believed that the universe was created by the Word of God. And so it's not too much of a surprise for us to understand that this discussion of atheism or of the creator God as opposed to there being no God, no creator, comes down to a debate about origins. And it comes down to sort of the creation evolution debate, because that's sort of the place where it all funnels to. So we'll talk about that for just a few minutes here in this session this evening. So many times these days particularly, those who would argue against the existence of God, atheism or atheist, would argue that they have reason on their side. They have science on their side, and even sometimes that they have morality on their side. Think with me along those lines for just a few minutes here. Do atheists have reason on their side more so than Christians have reason on their side to argue their point? I would say not, obviously, and one who would be a disbeliever would say, well, you say that because you are a Christian. And I suppose there's, something to that. But to argue that those who would argue against God have reason on their side and that Christians do not, just simply doesn't make any sense. Because so many of the things that are argued against the Bible's view of God are really just arguments against the actions of people. Many atheists will say that the reason I don't believe in God is because there are so many hypocrites among the Christians. Or the reason I can't believe in God is that Christians are just not clear thinking. Christians are, some would even say that Christians are just stupid people. And obviously they're not, or at least not all of them are. But there are some that seem a little strange and a little extreme, if you will, that make most of us as Christians embarrassed. But the truth is, there are those who disbelieve in God that are also hypocrites. There are those who disbelieve in God that make ridiculous arguments to try to set up their case. And that is all talking about the actions of people. It doesn't have anything to do with what we can see or what we could know about Jesus. One person said, and I liked it this way, he said, you can't fault religion for the crimes of its heretics. None of us want to be judged by the people in our family that don't do well. None of us want ourselves to be judged by other people that just have a connection to us in some way. We want to stand or fail on our own merit and on our own actions. And that should be true in this case as well. You see, there shouldn't be an argument that my view is more reasonable because there are people on your side that don't make sense. There shouldn't be an argument that my side of an argument is more reasonable because there's people on your side that aren't true to the principles that they claim to believe in, because that's going to be true on both sides of any argument. One of the so-called reason or reasonable arguments that many atheists will make is when hit with the difficulty of dealing with intelligent design. Because most everything that's out there these days, and most all of the new things that we're seeing over the last few years as far as this debate is concerned, is about the intricacies of this creation, about just the complexity and the obvious design that is there. And many an atheist will say, well, I could believe in design, but I can't believe in God. Or they will argue that you can't believe in design because design demands an intellect, design demands somebody outside of the creation thinking through these things and thinking of these things. And the question then comes, well, then where did God come from? And to suggest that you can't believe in the intricacies of the things that we can see in science because you can't explain where God came from is just not reasonable at all. So I think it's easy to assume, it's easy to argue that reason does not reside on the side of the atheist any more than it resides solely on the side of the Christian. But I think, and I believe, obviously, that reason favors the biblical view because it is reasonable, because our God has always been reasonable. We mentioned, I believe, last week that much, if not most all, of scientific arguments these days are a belief in some form of a Big Bang. There's no more arguing for Darwinian evolution of slow, methodical, primordial soup becoming a single-cell organism, becoming a multicell organism, becoming, a fish or a serpent or something like that. But there is a full understanding that the world had a cataclysmic, a great energy beginning at a particular point in time. And if you look at what the Bible suggests, the Bible can be aligned very easily with such a belief as far as how origins began. But you see, the thing is, a Big Bang needs a spark. A Big Bang needs a force. A Big Bang needs a power. A Big Bang needs a design. It needs an intellect. Atheism, still from this sort of an angle, has to argue that all of this that we see came from nothing. Now, Hebrews chapter 11, as we just read a few moments ago, argues that all of this came from things that were not visible. But it didn't argue that all of these things simply came from nothing, but that God spoke things into being. God created. And that's why it says that the universe was created by the Word of God. Design, the intricacies of this world in which we live, imply a designer. They imply a creator. They imply a power that transcends this natural world. They reasonably imply, God. The atheist also argues that science is on his side. But is that really the case either? I think not. Atheists sometimes say that science has disproved God, but nothing even close to that is the case. I like an argument that Greg Koukl has a great apologist mind and a really broad apologist website called, I think it's still tagged as str.org, stands to reason.org. But anyway, Greg Koukl, great thinker of our day and a great teacher, debater. He asked the question. He says, can you use a yardstick to weigh a chicken? And you think about that and you realize that, well, no, you can't. Now, can you weigh a chicken? Can you guess at the weight of a chicken? Well, yes, you can. Can you use a yardstick to weigh a chicken? No, you would need a scale. Now, you also cannot use a scale to measure a chicken, but his point still remains pretty well made. And that is that science cannot prove there is no God, because science can't be used to measure God. Science can't be used to measure transcendent things. Science can't be used to measure the spiritual. Science, by its very definition, measures the natural world. And it's based on facts that can be known from the natural world. And science is wonderful, and science, we learn a lot of things by great scientific research. And oftentimes, Christianity is seen as being anti-science. Not at all. We should never accept that claim to be made, because it's not true at all. A Christian, a believer, has full faith in true science. But here's the point. Too many people who are relying on science, they're relying on science to answer all questions, rather than relying on science to answer the questions in its purview. Science deals with the natural world. Faith deals with the spiritual world. There was a broad study back several years ago, I think it was published in Time or Newsweek, one or the other, about consciousness. And this thought of individual consciousness, of a soul, of an inner being. And I'm probably making this way too simplistic, but at the same time, the conclusion of this broad study and this long, extensive article was that science can't define consciousness, and that there seems to be no place in the brain where consciousness resides. And you see things like that and you say, and you dared call that science? No, the reality is consciousness cannot be measured scientifically. And if you would just, if a person would be honest enough to admit that, then that would be something. But the reality is that science was never meant to measure consciousness. Science was never able to do that. That too many scientists and too many people who want to rely on science for all of their answers then push answers on science that science simply does not have. The conclusion about on whose side is science on, science is not on anyone's side. Science is what it is. Now, unfortunately, as I've suggested, there are too many scientists who are demanding that atheism be on their side and align itself with them. And they simply assume those things. We mentioned, I think it was last week, the quote from Richard Dawkins out of The God Delusion. I'll remind you of it again. He says, "I cannot know for certain, but I think God is very improbable. And I live my life on the assumption that he is not there." Now, if the only answer you'll consider as a possibility is a material scientific answer, then that's where you end up. You either assume that God is there and you trust in him, or you assume that God is not there and you live your life accordingly. But Dawkins, in this honest moment, didn't argue that he could prove that God wasn't there. He, in his honesty, says, I think God is very improbable, and I live my life as though he is not there. And once I think about a quote, there's another very interesting quote. It's a little longer and a little more deep, if you will, but it says something significant. It's Richard Lewontin, and he is a professor, was for many years a professor of genetics at Harvard University. And here's the statement that he makes. He says, "Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation for the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive or how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. To appeal to an omnipotent deity is to allow that at any moment the regularities of nature may be ruptured, that miracles may happen. In his honesty again, he says, basically here, and I'll paraphrase, that there is a real struggle between science and the supernatural, and that too many scientists are simply accepting that the supernatural can't exist for two basic reasons. Number one, they're committed to materialism. Now, materialism is the belief that everything can be explained, or everything has its root and its beginning in the natural world. And the other problem, and the other thing that he admits, is that and he says we, as in many scientists, are not about to let a divine foot in the door because they're not willing to accept the possibility of God. And I've said it many times, and you may have as well, that if you began your exploration of the debate of creation evolution, and the first thing you do is you throw out the possibility of God, then evolution, Big Bang, Darwinianism, whatever, those are the only options left to you. And you didn't come to that conclusion because of an honest search. You came to that conclusion because out of hand from the beginning, you rejected the only other valid, and in reality, the most valid explanation. But Lewontin, in this statement here, readily admits that most of science is not geared to pursue truth wherever it may lead, but rather they're committed to materialism and only consider materialistic explanations. Surprisingly enough, science oftentimes, or atheists I should say, oftentimes argue for the moral high ground. And they do so by arguing that there are, as we said earlier, Christians who are hypocrites. They talk about the Great Crusades and how many people died in the name of religious wars and at the hand of religious heretics. And as I said this just a moment ago, none of us want to be judged by the ones who are somewhat like us or somewhat kin to us, but do bad things. And that would apply to both sides of this argument. And there's even claims made that more lives have been lost by religious wars and religious debates than through anything that we might call atheistic or evil. And the simple truth is that I believe that, I think that can be disproven very quickly, because you can list 4 simple names that account for an awful lot more people that have been destroyed and more people that have died because of evil, because of disbelief in this world. Names like Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, Mao Zedong. You could name a few others, more recent to us. But the point is, you cannot argue against God simply because some people in the name of God have not done well. You have to have that debate based on the evidence that is there. When you think about the possibilities and when you think about the options, is it easier to believe that God is not there and that somehow this magnificent, complex world we live in and our magnificently complex bodies simply got here somehow, and that we simply evolved from nothing over a period of time? Well, the atheist will argue generally that that's the only option. It has to be true because it's the only option. Stephen Hawking makes an interesting argument, at the same time somewhat of an absurd argument. It was Stephen Hawking who popularized the idea of the multiverse theory. And he was challenged, and he kept being challenged by the fact that we live in a universe and we live on a planet where this great intricacies and that the math and the probabilities are simply too large to fathom, too large to argue with. The improbability of things on this earth happening and being the way they are so astronomical that the only way he could put his mind around it to argue for it was to argue the multiverse theory. And what that basically argues is there are so many universes out there that we don't know about. And there are millions and millions and millions of universes out there. And we happen to live on the one where all of these things came together. Now, he then talks about the multiverse theory as being proof to explain away all the intricacies of and the implications that are the things that imply intelligent design. Except there's one big, huge problem with that argument. And that is that the idea that there are millions and millions of universes is simply not proven. He simply says it, and because he says it is possible, then he argues that it is the case, and then he moves right on to argue that's why we live on the one planet in which all of these things came together in just such a way. My point of going into some of these things for this lesson was simply to emphasize something that we've tried to say in several ways, and that is that we all have faith. As Christians, we need not be discouraged. We need not feel less than. We need not feel like we're just sort of out there on a limb because we trust in God where we cannot see. Because the reality is, no matter what you believe, you have faith. And many would argue, as did Turek and Geisler in their book, where they, by the title, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And the point of that book is that it takes more faith, more trust in things that we maybe cannot prove immediately. It takes more faith to be an atheist than it does to be a Christian. As I suggested earlier, is it easier to believe that there is a great, intelligent creator that created this universe? Or is it easier to believe that it simply came into being on its own over, even if you give it millions and millions of years to do so? Now, the reality is, it's not about what is easier to believe. But for those who would suggest to us Christians that our faith is ridiculous, I would simply say, your faith is more far-fetched than mine. As we've been saying all along, and as we draw sort of near to our conclusion of this series, God asked Abraham to go to a place that he would show him. And he asked him to go based on his trust in him. He asked him to go based on faith. And that's what God has always asked of us. He's asked us to have faith. But the reality is, whether you believe in God or not, everyone has faith. Everyone believes in something, even if your belief in something is a refusal to believe something else. We all are people and creatures of faith. Thank you so much for joining us for this lesson today. I trust that you're having a good week. Hope you're having a good day today. Thank you for joining us. I'll hope to see you on Sunday.